Hello again. I'm Dr. Steve Klein from the Department of Communication at the University of Missouri. This is the latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and helpful concepts for the study of communication. In this video, we're going to take a look at the relationship between perception and self-concept. When we're thinking about our sense of self, we're often very comfortable in considering ourselves intensely individual. I am my own person. Sometimes I may act in certain ways, but that doesn't necessarily change the person who I am inside. We'll often make distinctions between who I really am and other things that may display different senses of who I am. But the fact is that our sense of self is not a simple and monolithic thing. Rather, our sense of self is multifaceted, diverse, and something that's always changing. And a big argument from the standpoint of social psychology, sociological theory, and communication theory, especially in interpersonal communication, is the idea that our sense of self is actually very social, in addition to being very individual. And communication plays a big role in shaping our self-concept throughout our lives. So in order to understand this, let's get a baseline definition of self-concept first. The overall idea of who a person thinks they are. Now, this is pretty straightforward, right? But it's important to remember that there are going to be a lot of different things that go into this sense of self-concept. Now, of course, there are personal characteristics that we perceive. We may see ourselves as more introverted or more extroverted. I may see myself as someone who is very intuitive. Perhaps I'm someone who is very intelligent. Maybe I'm someone who doesn't have a lot of book smarts, but I've got street smarts. There's all kinds of things that I can perceive are who make me the me that I am. Now, however, there aren't just things that are individually oriented that constitute our self-concept. We also often think of ourselves in terms of group and social affiliations. The old cliche, no one is an island, is pretty true, right? I'm not just an isolated individual. I'm a member of a family. I am a member of a peer group and a circle of friends. I may be a teacher or a student, perhaps a professor or a student at the University of Missouri. I am a member of a football team or a choir or a theater ensemble. I may be a citizen of the state of Missouri. I may be a citizen of the United States. I may be a person who is a citizen of the world, right? So who I am is actually something that combines the individual with the social, and depending on the contexts that I find myself in, I may end up understanding and articulating who I am in some very different ways, depending on the time and the place that I happen to find myself in. Now, these ideas are explained really well by an important theory, one of the first theories in social psychology and sociology that is also really important for interpersonal communication as well. And that's symbolic interactionism theory. This theory was developed in the 1930s by George Herbert Mead and articulated in his posthumously published Mind, Self, and Society in 1934. Three central premises explain symbolic interaction theory in a pretty basic way. First of all, we act on things based on the meanings we ascribe to them. This is the process of perception. And in a previous video in the series, we take a look at how perception operates. We take in sensory information in a selective way, we organize it in our minds in ways that make sense, and ultimately we interpret that organized information based on our previously understood knowledge and experiences in order to figure out what things mean. Now, as we also started considering in that earlier video, the second premise of SI theory, we determine meanings based on social interactions through symbol use. In other words, the communication, the interactions that we have with other people throughout our lives, the families that bring us up, the friends that we grow up with, the teachers that we have in school, the various members of the community, co-workers at the workplace, all the interactions we have throughout our lives involving communication help us to develop what things mean and how the meanings of things change. And finally, human thought itself operates as an inner conversation. There are ways in which, especially when we're considering abstract concepts, things like freedom or love or democracy. A lot of things that we think about can't really be understood without certain symbolic representations that stand for abstract ideas and the things connected to them. So even when we're by ourselves, we engage in what's often referred to as intrapersonal communication. We talk with ourselves, cognitively speaking, having a conversation in order to try things out and figure out what things mean. So what does this have to do with self-concept? Well, when we think about our sense of self, there are a couple of factors that are in constant conversation and tension with one another. And George Herbert Mead referred to these as the I versus the me. On the one hand, the I is the spontaneous, wholly individual self. Think about emotional and cognitive instinct. Think about the you that blurts things out when you're particularly emotionally charged and your filter is turned off. Think about the you that replays conversations that you had a little bit earlier, or engages in some singing and rocking out in your car when you think no one's watching, right? The self that is you when you're not involved in a social situation. However, there's also the me, the self that you perceive that others see, your socially learned self. Because the ways in which we ascribe meaning to anything that we think about is impacted in a great degree by our social interactions, we often learn a lot about ourselves from other people. This sense of the me was articulated by a scholar named Cooley as the looking glass self. The looking glass self, and you can think about looking at yourself in a mirror as the metaphor to help understand this, we see ourselves reflected in other people's reactions to us, and then form our self-concept based on how we believe others see us. Now, we want to make sure we're not oversimplifying this. The me, or the looking glass self, is not the way other people see us. We can't necessarily know absolutely how other people see us. The me, or the looking glass self, is our perceptions of the way that other people see us. How do I think other people are seeing me? And that process of perception is what's referred to by SI theorists as reflected appraisal. And it basically works like this. I've got a sense of self. So let's say, for example, that part of my self-concept is that I'm a happy-go-lucky guy, I like having fun, I think I have a sense of humor, and I especially like to have fun with my family. So, on a family vacation in Memphis, Tennessee, while we're visiting Sun Studios, where Elvis Presley recorded some of his classic hits, Elvis's microphone stand is there, and I engage in some behavior. I start screwing around doing my great Elvis impersonation. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm sorry, I won't ever do that again in a video. And so my behavior is exhibiting aspects of my self-concept. Now, that behavior is observed by my kids. My kids are among the group of people that I would consider significant others. In this theoretical construct, significant others refers to anybody whose perceptions are important to you. So it could be family members, it could be romantic partners, it could be friends, it could be other people in the community whose opinions and perceptions matter to you for whatever reason. So I'm doing my Elvis and my kids are mortified. Come on, Dad, cut it out. I can't even look at you. So those responses come out, and inevitably I start perceiving. I don't just perceive and try to make sense of my kids' responses, but I'm also looking back at my own behavior and trying to make sense of that. And these particular perceptions end up folding back into my self-concept. And so maybe there are parts of my kids' responses that tell me something like, well, maybe I go a little bit too far sometimes and I ought to pull it back and put on a filter when I'm in front of other people. Or part of me may think to myself, well, they're really overreacting. They really clearly don't get how charming I am. It could be a variety of different conclusions that I draw. But the idea is I look at my behavior through the lens of how other people are responding to that behavior. I try to make sense of that, and that folds into my self-concept. In order to illustrate this idea, let's take a look at a clip from one of my favorite films, the 1980s teen classic, The Breakfast Club. In this scene, we have 3 of the 5 Chicago suburbanite teenagers that are on Saturday detention in their high school. We've got Brian, who is a stereotypical brain. He's an honor student who really doesn't interact with the kinds of people that are in this scene, such as John Bender, who is someone who's often referred to as a burnout. He's one of those kids that goes out and smokes during lunchtime, etc., etc. And then there's Claire Standish, one of the most popular girls in school, and is someone who doesn't really interact with either of these types of guys. Now, watch this conversation and see how the folks in the conversation, particularly Brian, I think is helpful to look at in this case. How does Brian's sense of who he is get challenged to some extent by the way that other people perceive him, how he alters his behavior in order to try to elicit different kinds of responses, and then how he ends up perceiving and bringing this information into his newly evolving sense of self. Okay, so how can we end up accounting for some of Brian's behavior? Particularly the idea that he wants to be very secretive about his sexual history. He, in fact, does some pretty obvious fibbing about it at a certain point, and wants to conceal this from the girl that's in close proximity, and finally ends up disclosing some information that he didn't want to disclose in order to repair what he sees as faulty responses from the others around him, particularly Claire. These kinds of behaviors can be explained by another important theory related to self-concept, and that's the idea of dramaturgical theory, developed by Erving Goffman, particularly in his classic 1956, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. Dramaturgical theory is a complicated sounding phrase, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It goes back to Shakespeare. All the world is a stage, and we upon it merely players. Goffman's idea is that we can understand social interactions in similar ways to theatrical performances. The reason for this is because those we encounter try to form impressions of us. In a previous video in this series, we talk about the ways in which we engage in attribution, or trying to perceive or make sense of other people, who they are and why they do what they do. Now, of course, we know that other people are trying to form impressions of us all the time, and we are motivated to want them to see us in certain ways. So we work to manage those impressions by performing a particular version of ourselves. As the esteemed social philosopher and stand-up comedian Chris Rock once observed,
"That's right, when you meet somebody for the first time, you're not meeting them, you're meeting their representative."
What this basically means is that we are presenting certain versions of ourselves, certain aspects of our self-concept that we want other people to see. It's not necessarily being fake, although certainly that is an option, and we've all met fake people from time to time. But the idea is that when we're on stage in a particular setting, we want other people to form certain kinds of impressions of us. And so we try to heighten those aspects of ourselves that we want them to see, as opposed to those other kinds of aspects of our self-concept that we might reveal if we were backstage, if we were not in this setting at that time. Now, of course, the idea of onstage and backstage for Goffman is one that's very fluid and changing depending on the context. The best way to understand this, very simply, is the way that you might behave if you're at a club or if you're at a party trying to make new friends or attract a potential romantic relationship. You wouldn't necessarily communicate and act in the same ways if you were having dinner at your elderly Aunt Tilly's house, right? Different contexts mean that you want the people, the significant others in that situation, to interpret your sense of self in a particular way. So you communicate and behave in ways that are going to be consonant with that. So when we think about the concept of self-disclosure, the purposeful disclosure of personal information to another person, we know that this is going to be something that's centrally important to impression management. We want people to know about us, and so we're going to share, here's some things about me that I want you to know. because that's how you're going to form an impression of me. Goffman teaches us that the self-disclosure process is selective, and it's strategic. What we do is we present a sense of face, what Goffman referred to as the positive social value a person claims for himself by the line others assume he has taken during a particular contact, an image of self delineated in terms of approved social attributes. In other words, it is that performance. I am acting the part of Steve Klein in this context in order for you to see certain things that you're going to approve of and interpret favorably. So the work that I do communication-wise in order to put that face out there is what Goffman refers to as face work. The communication acts that one uses to perform a selective, idealized sense of self for others to perceive. So let's try to understand the dynamic between dramaturgical emphasis on face and face work with the process of reflected appraisal, and how the way in which we understand ourselves and the ways in which we want to try to put our ideal sense of self out there is going to change and evolve over constantly cycling iterations of social interaction with other people. Remember, we have a sense of self, so we behave in ways that are going to put that sense of self, that idealized sense of self, in terms of face, out there. Other people are going to respond to it. I perceive how they respond to it. I look back at my own behavior, reintegrate that in some ways into my self-concept, lather, rinse, repeat. Let's take a look at the Breakfast Club kids a little bit later on that day in detention. Unpack the scene in terms of the process of reflected appraisal, and especially the way that face and face work play a really important role in this process. You can get a better understanding of how many of these characters are responding. They want to be seen in a particular way, and so they behave in ways that are going to put that idealized version of themselves out there. However, they're getting responses from significant others, in this case, the people that they are force sharing this Saturday detention with, and people who are very different from them and have very different senses of norms and social rules for what's acceptable and what's unacceptable behavior. And they're being confronted with the sense that their comfortable sense of self from their previous social context, their clique groups, the kind of kids that they normally hang out with, are not really being seen as acceptable in this kind of context. So they're perceiving their behavior through the lens of these responses. They try to make adjustments based on what they're learning about themselves and their self-concept. They behave in ways that are reflecting this kind of learning, and lather, rinse, repeat. In a nutshell, that is a lot of theory spanning kind of a century's worth of social psychology and sociological theory regarding perception and self-concept. If you've got any questions at all about the content in this video, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.